Welcome to your personalized deep dive. This time we're going deeper into a topic that's often a challenge for those with autism, hyperacusis.
It's like we're zooming in on how sound can be experienced so differently.
Exactly. Our source today is a blog post called Autism and Hyperacusis, a sensory overload.
From a site called Cheap ABA.
Yeah. So before we really get into hyperacusis, maybe we could start with just a little bit of a refresher on what ASD, autism spectrum disorder, actually is.
Well, it's a neurodevelopmental condition, which basically means it affects how the brain grows and develops. And it impacts how people interact socially, how they communicate, and you'll often see repetitive behaviors. But a really important thing to remember is that a lot of autistic people experience heightened sensory sensitivity.
It's like their senses are turned way up, picking up on things the rest of us just don't notice.
That's a really good way to think about it. And that's a big part of what leads to hyperacusis.
So, I mean, for someone who's maybe never even heard of this, what exactly is hyperacusis?
Imagine if everyday sounds, things like the hum of a refrigerator or people talking, suddenly felt as loud as a rock concert.
Wow.
That's basically hyperacusis.
So the article mentions traffic being a big one.
Oh yeah, for someone with hyperacusis, that could be like actual physical pain. It's not just about volume, it's about how their brain processes and reacts to the sound itself.
Oh, wow. That makes a lot more sense now why autistic individuals are more likely to experience this.
Right, it comes back to those heightened sensitivities. Their auditory system, so the parts of the brain dealing with sound, are just more reactive.
Okay. So let's say I'm out at a restaurant, just having dinner with some friends. What would hyperacusis make that experience like?
Well, imagine all the sounds there, the clinking of dishes, conversations going on around you, music playing. They would all just become this overwhelming sensory overload.
Mm.
And it's not just discomfort. It's more like their brain is being bombarded with all this intense stimuli.
Almost like trying to concentrate during an earthquake.
Huh? Yeah. That's a good way to think about it. It's no wonder a lot of people end up avoiding social situations entirely because they're worried about being overwhelmed. And of course, that can lead to feelings of isolation and loneliness.
Yeah, it's really sad to think about that. And it's not just like loud events, is it? The post talks about problems in places that you would think are quiet, too.
Absolutely. Imagine a ticking clock sounding like a jackhammer.
Hmm.
If you have hyperacusis, that's what it can feel like. These sounds that most people barely notice can be incredibly distracting, making it almost impossible to concentrate. Think about trying to focus on work or studying with that going on.
Like a siren going off in your head, making it impossible to think straight.
Exactly. And that constant battle against sound can really wear you down mentally. Imagine always being on edge, waiting for the next overwhelming noise. That's a recipe for serious anxiety and stress, especially if you're already dealing with the challenges of autism.
It just adds another layer of difficulty to everything.
And then there's sleep. If every tiny noise is amplified, how do you ever get a good night's sleep? And being exhausted just makes it harder to cope with everything else. It's like this awful cycle.
Well, that all sounds pretty rough. Is there any hope for people dealing with this? Like, what can they do to manage these challenges? I know the post talks about some coping strategies.
Oh, there's absolutely hope. Now, there isn't one magic solution that works for everyone, but there are a lot of effective ways to manage hyperacusis. One that might surprise you is sound therapy.
Sound therapy. I thought that was like listening to calming nature sounds. How does that help with something like this?
Well, it's a bit more involved than just relaxation sounds. Think of it like retraining your ears, but instead of lifting weights, you're working with your brain. One technique is slowly exposing people to sounds that bother them, but in a controlled way. This helps their brain learn that those sounds aren't dangerous.
So it's kind of like exposure therapy, but for your ears.
Yeah, exactly. The idea is to gradually desensitize the brain to certain frequencies over time. Now, if someone needs more immediate relief, noise-canceling headphones can be a lifesaver.
I can see how blocking out all that background noise would be really helpful.
Exactly. They give people a sense of control over their sound environment. And for certain situations, custom-fitted earplugs are another great option. They're molded to fit a person's ear perfectly, so they offer really good protection.
So it seems like finding the right tools and strategies for each individual is really important.
That's exactly it. And when we come back, we can talk about some more of those coping strategies and also the importance of getting professional help.
Welcome back to our deep dive on hyperacusis. I gotta say, this is really eye-opening. It's like, we don't often think about just how differently people experience the world, especially if they're on the autism spectrum.
What's really interesting is how this all connects to the bigger picture of sensory processing differences, which, as we've said, are really common in autism. It's not just about, the ears themselves. It's really about how the brain interprets and reacts to sensory input in general.
So is it kind of like having a totally different operating system for your senses?
That's a fantastic way to put it. And just like with computers, some operating systems work better for certain tasks than others, right? For someone with hyperacusis, their brain might be amazingly good at picking up subtle sounds, but that same strength can make them more sensitive to overload.
This makes me think about how, like, we design the world for just one type of sensory experience, and we might be leaving a lot of people out.
Exactly. Think about like a workplace, right?
Yeah.
With those super bright fluorescent lights and constant background noise. That might be fine for some, but for someone with sensory sensitivities, it could be a nightmare. We got to do better at creating spaces that work for everyone.
So going back to hyperacusis specifically, what are some other things people can do to cope with this?
Well, we talked about sound therapy and using noise-canceling headphones or those custom earplugs. But there's also something called cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT for short.
Oh, I've heard of CBT. It seems like it's used for a lot of different things. How would it help with something like hyperacusis?
Well, imagine you're like constantly worried about encountering a loud noise. That anxiety can actually make you even more sensitive to sound. So CBT basically helps you identify and challenge those thoughts, which reduces your anxiety and gives you a sense of control over your reactions.
So it's not just about blocking out the sound, it's about changing how you relate to it internally.
Exactly. It's about giving people the power to manage their reactions instead of feeling totally helpless. And in some cases, medication might also be an option to help with anxiety or sleep problems.
Right. But like we've been saying, professional help is really important, isn't it?
Absolutely. If you or someone you know is struggling with hyperacusis, talking to an audiologist or other healthcare professional is crucial. They can help figure out what's going on, recommend specific treatments, and provide ongoing support.
So it's about finding the right path for each person. Now, I want to shift gears a bit. The blog post we've been looking at focuses on the challenges of hyperacusis, which are obviously very real. But I'm wondering, are there any potential upsides to having this, more sensitive hearing?
That's a great question. It's important to remember that, sensory differences aren't always bad. They're just different. Someone with hyperacusis might be really attuned to music. They might hear nuances and details that most people would miss. Or they might be super sensitive to changes in their environment, picking up on those subtle sounds that could signal danger.
So it's kind of like a superpower waiting to be harnessed.
Exactly. It's all about reframing how we think about neurodiversity. Instead of seeing these differences as deficits, we can start to appreciate them as valuable variations in human experience.
I feel like this deep dive has really opened my ears to the world of sound in a way I never thought possible.
And that's what makes these deep dives so exciting. It's about exploring different perspectives, challenging our assumptions, and learning something totally new.
But before we get carried away, let's make sure our listener is walking away with those key takeaways about hyperacusis.
Oh, good point. So I think the main takeaway here is that hyperacusis is a real condition, and it's often overlooked, but it can have a huge impact on people's lives. And it's not just about hating loud noises. It's about, that fundamental difference in how the brain processes sound.
And that difference can cause all kinds of problems, from feeling isolated and having trouble concentrating to dealing with anxiety and even sleep issues.
Right. But it's important to remember that it's not a hopeless situation. There are things people can do, like those headphones and that sound therapy we talked about, or maybe CBT and even medication sometimes. And, getting help from a professional is so important. This deep dive has really been about understanding a sensory experience that a lot of us probably didn't get before. And it's about raising awareness, being more empathetic, and making the world a better place for people with autism and hyperacusis.
Well, this has been a fascinating journey, and we're not done yet. We'll be back in just a minute to wrap up our deep dive into hyperacusis. We're back for the final part of our hyperacusis deep dive. It's interesting thinking about all the challenges we've talked about. It makes you realize how important it is to, really understand all the different ways people experience the world.
It's like we each have our own unique sensory lens, and that lens shapes how we see and interact with everything around us.
And for folks on the autism spectrum, that lens can be pretty different.
Absolutely. Their sensory experiences might be amplified or processed in ways that we wouldn't typically expect. It's not just about sensitivity. It's also about how they perceive and make sense of sensory input.
So it's not always about struggling with things like loud noises. Sometimes it's about experiencing the world in a much richer, more intense way.
Exactly. Think about like a musician with autism who can hear all these subtle harmonies and rhythms that most people miss. Or an artist who sees the world in this incredible explosion of colors and patterns. These differences can be a huge source of creativity and insight.
It's like they're tuned into a frequency that most of us just can't access.
That's a great way to put it. And when we embrace those differences, we open up a whole new world of understanding and appreciation for just how diverse human experience really is.
This deep dive has definitely made me rethink how I think about sensory experiences, especially in the context of autism. What would you say is like the one key takeaway about hyperacusis that you want our listener to remember?
I think the most important thing is to remember that it's a real condition that often gets overlooked, but it can have a huge impact on people's lives. And it's not just about hating loud noises, it's about a fundamental difference in how the brain processes sound.
And that difference can lead to all sorts of challenges, right? Like feeling isolated, having trouble focusing, dealing with anxiety, and even problems sleeping.
Exactly. But it's not a hopeless situation. There are things people can do to manage those challenges, like we talked about, using noise-canceling headphones, doing sound therapy, exploring CBT, and maybe even medication in some cases.
And of course, seeking help from a professional is so important.
Absolutely. Finding the right tools and strategies can make a world of difference.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We started with understanding what hyperacusis is and how it relates to autism. Then we talked about the challenges it presents and all the different coping strategies that are out there.
We also touched on that bigger idea of neurodiversity and why it's so important to embrace the unique ways that everyone experiences the world.
So, to our listener, we hope this deep dive has made you curious to learn more about hyperacusis. But even more than that, we hope it's made you think about the different ways people around you might experience the world.
Maybe think about the people in your life. How might their experience be different from yours? What could you do to create a more inclusive and understanding environment for everyone?
Those are some great questions to think about. And on that note, we've come to the end of our deep dive into the amazing world of hyperacusis. Thanks for joining us on this journey.
And remember, this is just the beginning. There's so much more to explore.
Thanks for listening. And until next time, keep diving deep.